Welcome, everybody. Again, my name is Michael Getz. I'm the Director for UVA Clubs and Global Engagement in the Office of Engagement at the University of Virginia. It's really great to see everybody here tonight here on Zoom for this program brought to you by the UVA Club of Washington, D.C. I work with that particular club, and it's a great honor and privilege to work with our DC Who's, who do a ton of programming to help bring UVA to the district and to the DMV area. So just a couple quick things from my end. We have everybody muted to make sure we don't have too much interference or background noise while we're having our speaker and our conversation tonight. And so we'll just ask folks to remain on mute. And then also, please feel free to submit questions via the chat box. And when we get to a point a little bit later after Kyle gives his presentation, then we will be able to do Q&A via the chat box, which is at the bottom of your screen there. If you have any questions or problems, you can feel free to message me with that. So again, thank you all so much for making time for this on an exciting night in politics in the United States. And we're grateful to have you all here, grateful for the clubs planning this and for Kyle's joining us. And I will hand it over at this point to Boo Devaney, who is the one of the co-chairs of the networking committee for the UVA Club of Washington, D.C. Take it away, Boo.
Thanks, Michael. As Michael already said, I'm Boo Devaney. I'm working co-chairs for DC Who's along with Alston. Alston, do you want to say a quick hello?
Hi everybody, I'm Alston. I'm another co-chair of the networking club for the UVA Club of DC, and we're super excited to have you all here and to have Kyle as our guest speaker.
Yeah, so we'll keep our part short. A quick introduction for Kyle. Kyle Kondik is managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball, the University of Virginia Center for Politics authoritative nonpartisan newsletter on American campaigns and elections. He's a frequently cited expert on American politics who has appeared on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, PBS NewsHour, and Comedy Central's The Daily Show. His book on Ohio's presidential voting history, The Bellwether, was released in June 2016. And he also serves as the center's communication director and is based in Washington, where he manages the center's DC office. So with that, we will turn it over to Kyle.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about sort of the state of play here as we head into the debate season, starting in a couple hours now, and maybe some things to watch as we enter the final month of this campaign. And one thing that is very striking to me about it is that we've gone through this, I think, pretty terrible year for the United States. Based on coronavirus and all the cascading effects of coronavirus. And it's really a challenging year, I think, for any incumbent president to be running for re-election. If you just think about when, say, Jimmy Carter lost in 1980, for instance. 1980 was another pretty bad year in U.S. life. You had the Iran hostage crisis. There was all sorts of economic problems in 1980, and shortages and other things, which I think helped Ronald Reagan eventually defeat Jimmy Carter in that election in what was a pretty decisive result. But the striking thing is that even though we went from a time of relative peace and prosperity in January and February, albeit a time also of a lot of political strife and dislocation, obviously the impeachment of the president and other things going on, you go from this time of relative peace and prosperity to this time of crisis, I think it's fair to say. And yet perceptions of the president and the political situation have not really changed all that much. So there are a couple of polling aggregators that we like to use. One of them is Real Clear Politics. The other one is 538, which is Nate Silver's site. And so I just want to compare the numbers from earlier this year to now. And so if you go back to March 1st, so that was really a couple of weeks before coronavirus really started to affect people's daily lives. And also, but right before Super Tuesday, Joe Biden had just won the South Carolina primary the day before March 1st. He would do really well on Super Tuesday, end up sort of consolidating the Democratic vote. But he was not really the presumptive nominee back then. The tide at that time was only starting to turn, I think, against Bernie Sanders, who for a few weeks kind of looked like he might be the favorite to win the nomination. But so anyway, on March 1st, the president's net approval rating was -6 in Real Clear Politics, meaning that his disapproval rating was 6 points higher than his approval rating. It's not where you want to be as an incumbent president, but it's also not horrible either. In 538, it was -9. These two polling aggregators, they use slightly different numbers. They have slightly different ways of averaging the polls. So anyway, the president's approval rating was underwater, but not hugely so. As of today, the president is -8 in Real Clear Politics, and he's -9 in 538, exactly the same as he was back on March 1st. So a little bit worse in one poll average and basically the same in another. At that time, there also were national polls testing Joe Biden against Donald Trump. In Real Clear Politics, Biden was leading by 5 points over Trump, and it was 4 in 538. As of this morning, Biden's lead was 6 in Real Clear Politics, and it was 7 in 538. So again, there's some erosion for the president here, but not really a lot. The numbers look very similar. Now, granted, I think it's important to note that, first of all, the national polls don't tell the story of the election because the Electoral College ultimately determines it. And I would say that Biden's standing in some of the key swing states are better than they were back in March. But also that I think it's fair to say that the president was doing maybe worse than he could or should have been doing before COVID, given the state of the country, and that it looked like kind of a rosy time to be running as an incumbent president. And now I think it's fair to say that the president maybe could or should be doing worse based on the state of the country, given, and the dramatic changes. But I think it also points to a reality that the electorate is not that movable these days, that there aren't a whole lot of people who are being persuaded and moved off their vote choice based on the state of the country. We've got kind of two, not necessarily evenly divided parties in terms of their support, but I think there's a kind of a high floor for both parties these days. You wouldn't really expect a major party presidential candidate to get really anything less than maybe 45%, whereas maybe a generation or two ago, when we used to have blowouts in American politics, the floor for the parties might have been more like 40% or something, and that floor was pushed by candidates like George McGovern in 1972 and Barry Goldwater in 1964, et cetera. The other thing is that even though the president has just eroded a little bit over the course of the COVID crisis, that erosion may ultimately be the difference between victory and defeat. If Biden were polling at +4 nationally and the swing states were close, you could imagine Trump winning the Electoral College again, even if he was losing the popular vote by a bigger margin than in 2016. But if Biden is up 6, 7, 8 points nationally, that it becomes harder to imagine there being kind of an Electoral College misfire big enough to elect the president under that sort of scenario. In terms of the numbers, there's some key differences between what they look like now compared to 2016. First of all, the parties are more unified. The president's getting more self-identified Republicans. Biden's getting more self-identified Democrats than Hillary Clinton did last time. Biden generally leads with independent voters, although different polls say different things about that group. Trump would go on to win independents somewhat narrowly in 2016 based on exit polls. There is a big segment of the electorate, maybe 30 to 35%, of people who call themselves independents. Most of those folks are actually lying. They think of themselves independents, but they actually have a fairly predictable vote choice, being either kind of a soft Democrat or a soft Republican. And it's also possible to win while losing independents. For instance, Barack Obama narrowly lost independent voters to Mitt Romney in 2012, but he was able to win because the electorate overall was a little more Democratic, so he could afford to lose independents. Also, there are fewer people saying they're going to vote third party. In polls, generally, third party candidates will poll better than they actually perform. And so particularly in the summer of 2016, you might have seen Libertarian Gary Johnson at 8-10% in national polls. He ended up getting 3%. Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, might have been at 3 or 4 or 5. She ended up only getting 1%. 6% of the electorate voted for a non-major party candidate in 2016. All expectations are that that percentage is going to be smaller in 2020. There is a libertarian, there is a Green Party candidate, although the Green is not on the ballot in every state. Kanye West is actually on the ballot in a handful of places, although not necessarily in the states that are going to be the most important for the election. But even if you grant that polls sort of overstate how third-party candidates are going to perform, there's just not much polling support for these third-party candidates. So the bottom line here is that there are, the polls are more stable than they were last time. Biden's leads are, I think, generally better than Hillary Clinton's, particularly if you go back like precisely 4 years ago to late September 2016. Clinton was really polling actually not that well at that point. She ended up getting a kind of a bounce out of the debates and the Access Hollywood tape that came out about Trump. But then I think the campaign ended poorly for Clinton with the release of the Jim Comey letter and other things. And so it was kind of this game of musical chairs where I think the music stopped at the wrong time for Clinton. But you're likelier in this election to see, instead of polls that say, Clinton is up 45-40 with 15% undecided and voting third party, you're likelier to see polls that are more like 50-45 Biden, meaning that those are both 5-point leads, but you'd rather have the latter numbers because there are fewer undecideds in the polls. And that's kind of where we are now. And it's a very steady race for Biden. There's a lot less, if you look at the polling averages, it's much more of kind of a straight line, both for Biden support and for Trump support, as opposed to kind of like a roller coaster here and there, which is kind of what you'd expect, I think, with an incumbent seeking re-election, as opposed to a race where there's an open seat. You've got two well-defined candidates running for president, and I think this election is very much kind of an up or down vote on Donald Trump, and the president has been unable to get his approval rating high enough so that you expect him to be able to get close to 50%. But he's also, he's got a high floor, so it's not impossible to imagine him winning again. And there's kind of a fine line in this election between one where Biden wins by 3 or 4 points nationally but still loses the Electoral College, and one where Biden wins by 7 or 8 nationally and gets like 400 electoral votes. I mean, it's that, there's that thin of a line between kind of a blowout or a really close election that might take a while to be decided. So there is still, I think, a bit of uncertainty here about the outcome, but this thing could get away from Trump pretty quickly. It wouldn't take that much movement for something like that to happen. Why is Biden polling better than Clinton performed? And so basically the main reason for this is that Biden is doing better with white voters, both white voters with and without a 4-year college degree. There's been this big split in the white electorate between those who do and do not have a 4-year college degree. White voters without a 4-year college degree, they've been a Republican-leaning group for a long time, particularly in the South. And that group got much more Republican in 2016 than it had been previously, not just in the South, but also in some of the key swing states of the North. Meanwhile, white voters who do have a 4-year degree used to be pretty reliable Republican voters, particularly in suburban areas. I'd say a lot of places in Northern Virginia used to be pretty reliably Republican a generation or two ago. That was fueled by good performances amongst kind of the white-collar workers in those places. That group has become more and more Democratic, which I think helps explain why Northern Virginia has become such a Democratic preserve, although Northern Virginia also is very diverse. And non-white voters, who make up about 25 to 30% of the national electorate, white voters make up the remainder. That non-white group is going to be about 75-25 Democratic, give or take. Biden's performance with those voters right now looks a lot like Clinton's did. And in fact, there's some indication that Biden might be underperforming a little bit with certain types of non-white voters, particularly Latino voters in a state like Florida, where in South Florida, a lot of people of Cuban ancestry have generally voted Republican over the years. Clinton did well with that group in 2016, although she ended up losing Florida. There seems to be some reversion to Trump amongst that group. But again, I bring all this up just to say that again, the reason that Biden is doing better is because of improvements with white voters. He's losing white voters without a 4-year degree by less than Clinton did, and he's winning white voters with a 4-year degree by more than Clinton did. And so when you hear about Trump problems in the suburbs in a lot of places, this is kind of the trend that we're talking about. And I think it also helps explain why what we've seen in the numbers recently is that Biden seems to be doing particularly well relative to Clinton in a lot of the northern battlegrounds, states ranging from Maine and New Hampshire to Michigan and Pennsylvania and Ohio and Wisconsin and Minnesota and Iowa. All of those states are whiter than the national average. And so if Biden's improvements are mostly coming with white voters, those are really the places where you'd expect to see those changes. And if Biden can kind of restore some of Obama's margins with white voters in some of these competitive Midwestern states, that's potentially a treasure trove of electoral votes. And the Midwest sort of remains consistently the one really competitive region in American politics. Of course, there are competitive states in other places too, Florida and North Carolina, Virginia to some extent, although it's become a state that votes kind of left of center. Arizona, Texas has now become kind of a swing state, although I think still leans more Republican. I guess the fear for people like me is, as I think back to 2016 and some of the problems with the polling, is what if the pollsters are basically just screwing up the white vote again? Like, what if Trump is actually doing fine with white voters and it's just not reflected in the polls because Trump supporters aren't responding to the polls, or there's some sort of weighting problem or whatever. And so if we wake up on November 4th and it looks like Trump is going to win, it may be because the instruments we're using to measure specifically the white vote in the North, maybe they're just not up to snuff after there were some problems in 2016. Now, I think the polls are reliable to a decent extent. They did fine in 2018. Probably understated Republicans a little bit in some of these Midwestern states, although Biden's leads in some of the crucial battlegrounds like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin are sort of big enough now that even if the polls are overstating Biden, he should still be okay in those states. But it is something I worry about, although it's not something that I can sort of quantify. So I can't sit here and look at the polls and say, oh, well, these polls are biased against the president. I mean, they don't seem that way when you look at the internals of them. But it is just something that I guess I worry about a little bit as an analyst. And I also think it shows that we have to be kind of, people in my profession have to be sort of modest about the extent to which we can know what's going on based on the polling. And so that's sort of the caveat I have for all of this stuff. Obviously we're going to the debate tonight. Historically, incumbent presidents sometimes struggle in their first debate. So that's, I think part of it is because they often don't have to have a credible primary. And of course, Donald Trump didn't. He was very similar to Barack Obama in 2012, George W. Bush in 2004, Bill Clinton in 1996. And so incumbent presidents maybe aren't used to being challenged the way that challengers are, because they had to go through their own nomination process. Specifically, Barack Obama in the first debate in 2012 basically bombed. And it actually kind of changed the race for a little bit in that the Romney supporters kind of got a shot in the arm, although it sort of turned out that Romney's surge after the first debate in 2012 was basically artificial in that it seemed like basically Republicans were just likely to respond to polls because they were fired up. Democrats were disheartened by Obama, but it didn't really change the race all that much. But that was kind of a strange thing to live through it, because it really seemed like for a couple of days that Obama had basically just like punted away his second term. But that ended up not being the case, obviously, although that was a competitive race. So I'm curious to see if, for all of the talk about Biden, potentially being a disaster and showing his age so much, I wonder if it's actually possible that Trump is the one who actually performs poorly tonight. But again, I don't really know what to expect. I will say that based on a lot of the numbers we've seen, and also I think the stability that we've seen in the numbers throughout this cycle, there aren't a lot of undecided voters out there. When voters are asked whether the debates are going to be important to their vote, smaller percentages of them say that they will be, compared to 2016 and 2012. So even the public is suggesting that they don't think their own choice is going to be swayed by by the debates. So I think the default position we should have is that unless something happens tonight that is like so obviously bad for one of the two candidates, and I can't even speculate necessarily what that would be. I think for Biden, it would be essentially kind of a senior moment that's so bad that it would sort of play into pre-existing concerns about his age, essentially, and his capacity to serve as president. For Trump, I think it would basically be saying something that was so obviously racist that it kind of it sort of brought up a lot of people's questions about him, because a lot of the public, even people who support the president, thinks that he sometimes goes too far on racial issues. So if I had to guess, that would be what it would be, because I think that, quote, gaffes in general, they sting more if they play into a kind of a preconceived notion about a person. So for Biden, the preconceived notion that he's been fighting is essentially that he's too old for the job. So if something happens that plays into that, then maybe that has more currency. And likewise for Trump, again, if it's some sort of outrageous comment on race or something like that, that's something that I could imagine, again, leaving a mark. But I think our default position should be that probably the debates won't change all that much, because hardly anything else has really changed this race throughout the cycle. You know, we also just had this big bombshell from the New York Times about the president's taxes. That's another thing that I think is a very significant story. The passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, that's another hugely impactful, important thing that I think is very important for the future of American governance. I can't look at the numbers and say, oh, well, the race has changed because of that happening. It hasn't. Again, unless the tools we're having to measure these things just aren't working, which again, I don't necessarily think is true, but I guess it's possible. We just don't see much impact from all of these seemingly earth-shattering kinds of stories. I think the bottom line here is this, and then I'm going to go through some of the specifics at the state level and the Senate and the House, et cetera. I think the bottom line here is that it's possible that the polls are off. However, they have to get closer for Trump to win. That would be how I would look at it. So, like, we're sitting here with Biden up 6-7 points nationally. He's up about the same amount in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, you know, the states that are probably likeliest to be the most crucial. He's leading in Arizona by a smaller amount. Florida and North Carolina are really close. So are Iowa and Ohio. Again, I'll get into that specifically. But there may be polling error that breaks in Trump's favor, but the numbers have to be closer than they are now, because the numbers were closer than they are now on the eve of the 2016 election. It was sort of close enough that polling error could sort of allow the president to win, which is in fact what happened. But again, you also can't assume that polling error will necessarily break in favor of the president. It might break in favor of Biden. Maybe he wins by 10 and, again, basically sweeps all the competitive states in the Electoral College. So again, that's why I say that there's a sort of fine line between Trump eking out another kind of fluky victory and Biden winning in a kind of an Obama 2008 style blowout. So with that, let me bring up a few maps here. Okay, so here are our current Electoral College ratings. And so we actually have Biden right at the precipice. We have 269 electoral votes at least leaning to him. We have 203 at least leaning to Trump. And we have 66 electoral votes worth of toss-ups: Arizona, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Florida. We also, if you see in the lower right there are two states, Maine and Nebraska, that actually award their electoral votes, not winner take all like every other state, but based on congressional districts. And Biden is actually favored in our accounting to win the Omaha-based Nebraska 2nd Congressional District, which Obama actually carried in 2008. And there's the northern Maine district, Maine 2. That's a district that Trump won by 10 last time, that we actually have as a toss-up this time. And there are certain scenarios in which those districts could actually be very impactful. I mean, again, we've got Biden at 269. So if you were to just win Maine 2, we get to 270, the magic number. So that is something to watch. Frankly, this map is generous to Trump right now. And in fact, it's possible that it might be a little less generous to Trump sometime relatively soon here, but stay tuned on that. But this is the map that we have right now. And again, I think at the very least, Biden is favored in two of the toss-ups, Wisconsin and Arizona, and with Florida and North Carolina maybe being closer to kind of that truer toss-up level. Iowa's really close. Ohio's really close. Georgia's really close. And Texas is also close, although I think of all those lean Republican, light red states, Texas is probably the heaviest lift for Biden, but it's also the biggest prize. And Texas is changing in ways that I think will make it more competitive going forward here. And you can really see the long-term problem for Republicans potentially in that the Democrats already dominate a lot of the big states like Illinois, New York, and California. If Democrats were to gain some sort of advantage in Texas, which I don't think we're there yet, but that's the sort of situation where it would be, pretty hard for the Republicans to win. Although long-term projections about one-party dominance in American politics almost always end up being bogus because something will happen that'll reorient the parties. Maybe in the long term, the white vote drifts more and more to the Republicans, and the Midwest becomes sort of a kind of a lean Republican region. Maybe the Democrats make up for that in the Sun Belt, but that just sort of creates sort of a new two-party equilibrium. So again, watch out for these sort of long-term predictions. And chances are some of the states that we think of as being dark red will become Democratic in the future, and some of the states we think of as being dark blue will become Republican in the future. Great example of that is like West Virginia. That state was so Democratic as recently as the 80s that it voted for Carter in 80 when he was getting blown out, and it voted for Michael Dukakis in 1988 when he was getting blown out by George H.W. Bush. Now it's arguably the most Republican state in the whole country. And it might actually be Trump's best state in his reelection bid. So again, this stuff changes over time. Again, I think the one sort of consistent thing is that the Midwest has always been kind of the crucial competitive region if you were to sort of look at this regionally speaking. And if you got questions about specific states, I'd be happy to take them. Senate, part of the reason the Senate is competitive is 53-47 Republican right now. Is just because the Republicans are defending more seats than the Democrats. And so, the more seats you're defending, the more chances you have to lose them. So there are 23 Republican-held seats on the ballot this year, only 12 Democratic ones. However, notice that a lot of the Republican-held Senate seats are in pretty reliably Republican states. So Idaho, Wyoming, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi. Those are all states where the Republicans should be fine in the Senate. That said, there is a path. There is a path for the Democrats to win Senate back. These are our ratings. We have the Republicans favored to pick up Alabama, where Doug Jones, who won kind of a fluky special election as Democrat in 2017, he's running for a full term this time and is a big underdog against Tommy Tuberville, the former Auburn football coach. However, the Democrats are favored, we think, at least 3 Republican-held seats, Maine, Colorado, and Arizona to varying degrees. We have 2 Republican-held toss-ups, Iowa and North Carolina, and then a number of states that we see as leaning Republican, so competitive Democratic targets, South Carolina, Georgia, Montana, potentially even like in Alaska or Kansas. So there's a world in which, again, particularly if Biden breaks open the presidential race, where the Democrats actually win a solid Senate majority in the low 50s. As of right now, my best bet would be something along the lines of a 50-50 Senate or 51-49 either way. If it's a 50-50 Senate, the vice president would break the ties. I think the Democrats are probably better positioned to win the presidency at this point, so that would be a nominally Democratic-controlled Senate with ties broken by hypothetical Vice President Kamala Harris. But these races are pretty competitive. So I think there's still a fair amount of drama in the Senate. And however confident or not confident you are in Biden winning the presidency, I think that Biden winning the presidency is probably a prerequisite for Democrats to win the Senate. So just keep that in mind. Not much to say about the House. Again, if you have questions about specific races, I'm happy to answer them. Democrats won the House majority in 2018. My best bet is that they're going to net seats as opposed to lose them, although I'm not expecting a whole lot of net change in the House. And a lot of the Democratic incumbents who won narrow victories in kind of Republican-leaning turf last time. They've been fortunate in that they've got much more money to spend than their Republican opponents. Republicans haven't done a great job of recruiting in a lot of these seats. So of the three categories of races, the one that I feel the most confident about is that Democrats will hold the U.S. House. So I think if the Democrats lost the House, I think everything we thought we knew about this election would be sort of going out the window. So I again add that caveat, but I think Democrats should be fine. So in terms of scenarios, for next year, I think probably the likeliest would be unified Democratic control of Washington, although potentially with just a very nominal Senate majority. Also not hard to imagine the second scenario, Democratic president, nominal Republican Senate majority, Democratic House. That's really a recipe for gridlock. And then also if Trump can come back in the presidential race, maybe we just have status quo, Republican president, Republican Senate, Democratic House, which again is a recipe for gridlock. If you want to follow along with the rest of the campaign, sign up for our newsletter. We come out actually usually just on Thursdays, but this year it's been multiple times a week. centerforpolitics.org/crystal ball. Just put in your email address and join our mailing list. We have also been doing a weekly webinar. You can find the links to that on our Crystal Ball site, also on our YouTube page, which is UVA CFP, so University of Virginia Center for Politics, UVA CFP. We do those. We release those at 2 p.m. on Thursdays, but you can, obviously you can watch them anytime after 2 p.m. on Thursdays. And we also have an audio version of that is available as podcast on Apple, Spotify, any sort of podcast provider you use. We've been putting the audio up there. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions that y'all might have.
Great, and thank you so much, Kyle, for that. That was very informative, and we all enjoyed it. And we do have one question. Do you have a preferred fact checker for this evening's debate?
I think that PolitiFact does a pretty good job. Daniel Dale at CNN, who probably some of you have seen, I think he gets so frustrated with some of the president's statements that he kind of gets kind of viscerally angry about it. But I think he does a pretty good job. Look, every American politician will fudge the truth for at least from time to time. The president really does seem to sort of stand out in terms of kind of glaring misstatements. Although, frankly, I think the president has shown in certain ways that his level of shamelessness is actually a pretty effective political weapon. So I'm just curious to see how that all shakes out tonight. Biden has said he wishes there was a fact checker. Speaker Pelosi actually said Biden shouldn't even debate Trump. I don't think that was really ever a practical option. And there's no indication that Biden was wanted to skip the debates. But yeah, there's, if you want to find factual information about what's going on, it's not hard to find at the kind of the big legacy media outlets. Unfortunately, I think that a lot of what gets passed around as sort of political information nowadays is through social media and is basically just garbage. And I don't think that that's just restricted to the president. There's just a lot of stuff out there that's just flat out inaccurate.
Thank you so much. Another question someone submitted: outside of Florida, which state do you think really controls the Electoral College outcome? Pennsylvania and Wisconsin seem the obvious choices, but is holding something like Minnesota the key for the Dems?
Look, I think if Biden were to lose Minnesota or even Michigan, frankly, that would be probably part of him losing the Electoral College. Because I think it would indicate, I mentioned before the improvements with white voters. It would suggest that that's actually not true. That Biden isn't doing better with white voters than Clinton did, and if he's losing Michigan or Minnesota, the whole Midwest outside Illinois falls apart. He certainly loses Iowa, Ohio, probably loses Wisconsin in that scenario, probably loses Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania seems like probably the most important state. I have a hard time imagining either candidate winning without it. But I mean, again, you could come up with scenarios. Overall, I think there's been a major focus on 6 kind of core swing states. Those are the states that are seeing the most campaign visits and campaign spending, et cetera. And so it's Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and the industrial North, which were the 3 decisive states in 2016. Trump won all of them by less than a point. Had they all voted for Clinton, she would be president. And then North Carolina, Florida, and Arizona in Sun Belt. If either candidate wins a majority of those states, I think that person is going to be the next president. And there's a world in which they split 3-3, in which that's maybe the scenario where we start to have some real questions about who actually won on election night.
Great, thank you, Kyle. The next question is, how have the demographics of the key states changed since 2016, as far as number of white, non-college, Hispanic population, et cetera?
Generally speaking, all of the states are getting a little bit more diverse over time and a little bit more educated. Now, these changes, they happen kind of slowly over time. And again, the key swing states, the industrial North, they're all whiter than the national average. They all have a higher percentage of white working class voters than the national average. But there's also there's demographic change happening everywhere. It just happens kind of slowly. I'd also say that if you just look at sort of the county by county census figures, some of the places where the president did the best are also some places that frankly aren't growing and also might be actually actively losing population. I think about in Ohio, where I'm from, the president did extremely well for a Republican in the sort of Appalachian parts of the state, eastern Ohio, extending from the Youngstown and Warren areas, kind of old line Democratic blue collar areas that where the floor finally fell out for the Democrats in 2016, all the way down the border with Pennsylvania and West Virginia to the southern tip of Ohio. A lot of those places are losing population, and so it may be that I think turnout's going to be pretty high everywhere, but it may be that there's just not much more. There's not much more juice that the president can sort of squeeze out of some of these places, because I feel pretty confident that the president's going to do worse in like suburban Philadelphia and suburban Twin Cities and greater Detroit, greater Columbus, those kinds of places. And even in the South, metro Atlanta, Research Triangle in North Carolina, Dallas, Austin, Phoenix, et cetera. In the North, is it possible for Trump to do even better than he did in kind of small city outstate areas than he did in 2016? I don't think so, which is part of the reason why I think Biden is favored, but I don't think we can rule that out either. So, maybe there's more ground for the president to gain. If there are places there where you went from, say, Romney by 15 to Trump by 30, could that be Trump by 40 this time? Again, I don't expect that. And I think the numbers suggest that maybe it'll be somewhere between Trump 2016 and Romney 2012. But who knows?
Thanks, Kyle. Another question, since many states will be counting mail-in ballots during the election night, which ones do you think will help predict the winner, especially if it takes a couple extra days or weeks to count the ballots?
If I had to say one, it would be Florida. Florida has long had a robust mail-in and early voting apparatus, and so they're used to that in that state. A lot of voters already take advantage of it. The state also counts votes very quickly. Now, also Florida often is very close, and so there are often questions about about certain problems in certain counties. Obviously, the 2000 election is a great example. There were discrepancies in the 2018 vote, but also the Senate race was decided by, I think, 10,000 votes out of millions cast. If Florida produces a decisive outcome, and decisive in Florida probably means like a 2 or 3 point victory for one of the two candidates, my guess is that person on the right side of that margin will probably be winning the election. because there are parts of Florida that can tell us about certain voting patterns in the Midwest. Particularly, there are a lot of Midwest expats in like the Tampa-St. Pete area, and some of Clinton's problems in that region were probably suggestive of their problems more broadly in the Midwest. But if Biden is bouncing back in some of those places, if he wins, for instance, Pinellas County, which is part of the Tampa-St. Pete area, that probably will say good things about him in the Midwest. States like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, they're not as used to having a robust mail-in early vote. And so those vote counts might take longer. But if Florida is voting, strong, again, I say decisive, but, maybe 2 or 3 points in favor of one or two candidates, I don't see that would be suggestive of a larger overall trend. North Carolina is another state that we should know a lot about on election night, I think. Of those 6 core battleground states, I think that's the hardest one for Biden, myself. So if Biden were to win North Carolina, I'd say it's probably curtains for Trump. We should know a lot about Ohio on election night, I think. That's another one that if Biden loses or if Biden wins, it's over for Trump. So we'll get some clues.
Great, thank you, Kyle. So this next one is kind of a 2-part question. Earlier, you alluded to the fact that voters are finding the debates less influential. The debates matter to less. Why is that? And then how can the debates influence the election outcome overall?
I think that the electorate has basically just become a little bit more kind of hardened in its partisanship. And therefore, you might not expect the debates to really be all that meaningful. But I don't necessarily know if they were that important in the recent past either. The one election that's a couple that sort of stand out where the debates probably had an important impact that political scientists believe anyway were 1960 with the first debates between Kennedy and Nixon, and also Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter in 1976. Those are both really close elections, and so closer an election is, the likely, the more things you could attribute the outcome to. But more recently, again, I think that voters, the people who do watch the debates generally have their minds made up anyway. There's just not as many persuadable voters out there. Also, let me make a broader point. Let's say that you are a conservative Republican who is pro-life, pro-gun, supportive of smaller government, et cetera. So, your belief system all lines up with the Republican Party. And let's say that tonight Trump makes some sort of gaffe or whatever. And you say, oh, well, I'm actually going to go vote for Biden, even though Biden doesn't believe in any of the stuff I do. Like, that actually is not, that doesn't actually make all that much sense as a voter. Like, if you're so movable that some event at a debate can totally change who you're going to vote for, then how strongly do you hold your beliefs anyway? You could say the same thing for a Democrat who may believe in, the opposite of all those positions. If Biden, says, the year 1900 instead of the year 2000 and makes some sort of gaffe that people make fun of him for, is that really a good reason to change your vote? I would personally say no, if you actually respect the beliefs that you have. And I think this is actually maybe telling too about, Republican loyalty to Trump. I mean, yeah, I think that in a lot of ways, Trump certainly isn't a traditional president. And frankly, I think that in many ways he is and was poorly suited for the job. However, I can understand why a lot of Republicans supported him, because he's better on their issues than Hillary Clinton was and Joe Biden is. And we can quibble as to whether, again, reasonable people can disagree as to whether he should hold the office or not. But I think it actually speaks well of voters that they vote based on their sort of issue portfolio, I think, and their partisanship, as opposed to changing their mind based on sort of ephemeral things that might happen in a debate.
Thanks. Kind of piggybacking off of that. How do pollsters account for the large number of Trump supporters that don't tell anyone other than their close friends that they will be voting for Trump?
There have been some studies conducted of the so-called shy Trump vote, and the studies basically don't indicate that it exists. One way that it's been tested is you might think if there was a shy Trump vote that people who reply to online polls and don't actually have to talk to a human, as opposed to those who talk to someone who's actually calling their telephone, you would think that maybe Trump would do better in the online polls if there was a shy Trump vote. That turns out not to really be true. Part of the reason that the polls sort of underestimated Trump in the Midwest, first of all, there were just a lot of undecideds and third-party voters who kind of, I think, broke toward Trump in the end, which is something that's hard to anticipate unless you're polling right up to Election Day. And also that the polls sort of overstated the education level of the electorate. And so I mentioned that, white voters with a 4-year degree sort of trending more Democratic. White voters with a 4-year degree are also likely to reply to polls. So you have to account for that if you're, as you're sort of weighting your polls and coming up with a projection. And some of the polls weren't doing that. I think they're probably do a better job of that now. But again, this is why I caution you that it's like we have to know what we can't know in that so many of the polls are suggesting that Biden really is improving with white voters. Very consistent theme throughout. Maybe there's something off about it. Now, here's the other thing though. Would it make sense that an incumbent president who didn't win the popular vote, who's never had good approval ratings, and who is in the midst of a terrible year to be running for incumbent, doesn't it make sense that that person would lose? I think it does. I think it makes intuitive sense that if someone only gets 46% of the vote, does very little to expand their base, that they would be in trouble in their reelection bid. And also, frankly, I don't think Biden is some sort of great candidate, but I do think he's a better candidate than Hillary Clinton was, particularly for some of the voters who didn't like Clinton and found Trump appealing in small town and rural America. So it intuitively makes sense to me that Trump would be in trouble, and that his support would have eroded from 2016 given the state of the country. So that sort of intuitive reasoning, I think, kind of backs up what we're seeing in the polls. But again, I think a lot of us feel burned from 2016, and I don't want to communicate to you that this election is like some sort of lead pipe lock for Biden. I don't think it is, even though I think his position is much better than Trump's.
Great, thank you. The next question is, will Virginia ever be a swing state again, or was it ever really a swing state?
Virginia was had this interesting transition from being pretty heavily Republican or right of center, and then kind of switching to being more Democratic over the course of maybe, a decade and a half or so. Look, here's the thing though, is that as soon as a new president gets elected and there's a new party in office, the dynamic totally changes. Often the president's party does poorly in midterms. There's a long-standing trend in Virginia that the gubernatorial race will break against the party of the president. Now that didn't happen in 2013, but that was the first time that had happened in a long time. And Terry McAuliffe almost lost the governor's race to Ken Cuccinelli, who a lot of people did not think was a particularly great Republican candidate. And I think a different Republican candidate probably would have beaten McAuliffe in 2013. So as soon as 2021, depending on what's going on, you could maybe see Republicans or Virginia sort of snap back and the Republicans to gain ground. This stuff is all cyclical. That said, I think in the long run, Virginia is becoming less of a kind of Southern aligned state. And of course, much of the rest of the South is Republican, although there are Democrats who are making gains in North Carolina, Georgia, some other places. And Virginia is kind of transitioning to becoming more part of the kind of northeastern megalopolis that extends from Boston all the way down to Washington now. And all those states that are part of that are generally Democratic. I mean, Pennsylvania sometimes isn't, but New York, Maryland, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. I think Virginia is sort of New Jersey. Virginia is sort of becoming more like those places over time.
Thank you. Looking to future elections, will the increase in absentee ballots and that effect on exit polls affect predicting how certain demographic groups are voting?
I'm sorry, could you read that again?
Yeah. For future elections, I think what they're trying to ask is the increase in absentee ballots.
Oh, yeah. Look, over time, the percentage of people who don't vote on election day is getting larger and larger. And we're going to see another big spike this year for obvious reasons, because people don't want to vote in person because of coronavirus. Now, personally, I think that a lot of folks probably will be comfortable voting in person, in part because we're sort of used to coronavirus. We're used to going to the grocery store at least, and some states have opened up more than others. But I think as people get more used to voting earlier by mail, they're going to find it to be convenient, and they're going to do more of it. So a larger and larger percentage of voters are probably going to vote by alternative methods. And what we're going to see this year is that it seems like there's going to be a huge partisan split, in that Democrats are going to be much likelier to vote by mail, much likelier to vote by early, and Republicans are much likelier to vote on election day. And I wonder if that's going to be kind of a persistent trend. And that is, in some states, that is a trend, although like in a state like Iowa, actually, the early mail-in vote is heavily Democratic. In Florida, actually, the mail-in vote was more Republican-leaning, but probably won't be this year. I don't necessarily know if it changes projections or anything. I mean, there have been a number of states out west that have gone to all mail-in voting, like Colorado and Washington and Oregon and Utah. There's not much evidence to suggest that those changes really affected the partisanship of those states in any significant kind of way.
Great, thank you. We do have another question. In 2018, the contentious Kavanaugh nomination did not appear to hurt Democrats in their push to reclaim the House, but arguably did help lead to losses for red state senators. If a similar dynamic plays out in 2020, what impact should we expect?
I could imagine that so there are a number of Republican senators who are doing worse than Trump in their states. And it's actually kind of a long list. You got Martha McSally in Arizona, Tom Tillis in North Carolina, Joni Ernst in Iowa, Steve Daines in Montana, Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, probably Dan Sullivan in Alaska. And I think the hope for some of these Republicans is that the court fight helps kind of bring their voting, or brings their percentages into alignment with the president's. And maybe that would happen anyway. That there's not much ticket splitting, and that Trump ends up winning all those states. Now, I think Trump's, challenged to win Iowa and Arizona and North Carolina. He'll win South Carolina and Montana, almost certainly, Alaska. But in 2018, you had, Joe Donnelly in Indiana, Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota, Claire McCaskill in Missouri. Those are more Republican states than, Arizona, Iowa, and North Carolina. And so, it might be that, it helps, Ernst and McSally and Tillis consolidate the Trump vote. But if Trump loses those states, they're cooked. So I don't know. I mean, I can't sit here and tell you that since Justice Ginsburg's passing that I've seen any sort of big change in the numbers. I think that the people who care about the court are probably the most engaged voters. We also know, generally speaking, the most engaged voters are also the most partisan. So if someone was 100% likely to vote, do they suddenly become 105% likely to vote? I mean, at a certain point, it doesn't really, if you've got hyper motivated people, it doesn't really change all that much. I mean, enthusiasm was already really high for this election. So does the Ginsburg thing, does Ginsburg passing really change that? Now, again, I don't want to minimize the importance of that happening, because it seems like the Republicans are going to confirm a replacement for Ginsburg, and that has very significant ramifications for the court. But I'm just talking about the politics of it. I don't see much of an impact at this point.
Great, thank you. And we do have one last final question on your closing thoughts ahead of the debate this evening.
Again, I would look, if you're looking for things that might have an impact tonight, look for things that reinforce a pre-existing negative impression of a candidate. Again, with Biden, I would say that that's probably age. And with Trump, I think it might have something to do with race or some other kind of fraught topic. And sometimes the press can sort of determine what matters and what doesn't, because there's going to be some sort of narrative that comes out of tonight. I don't necessarily know what it's going to be, but there are a lot of people who won't watch the debate, but they'll see coverage of it. They'll see clips from it. What's the clip that becomes important from this debate? It's impossible to know in advance, but we'll sort of be looking for it. Again, I think default position should be that probably the debate's not going to have that much of an impact, but who knows?
Great. Well, first and foremost, on behalf of the UVA Club of DC, thank you so much, Kyle, for joining us, and thank you everybody else. We encourage you all to visit dchoo's.org for all future virtual programming, and we hope that you all enjoy the debate. Thank you so much again, Kyle, and everybody for joining.